33 years old and still unmarried. The whisper travelled down the length of the banquet table like a current beneath still water, quiet enough to ignore and loud enough to feel. Princess Seraphina Caldwell pressed her fingers against the stem of her crystal glass and kept her eyes forward while laughter bloomed around her. The grand dining hall of Caldwell Palace glittered that evening with the kind of beauty that took architects 4 years and 3 design firms to create. Soaring ceilings of white Italian marble curved overhead in sweeping arches, fitted with recessed lighting that shifted from warm gold to soft ivory depending on the hour. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the south wall, overlooking manicured gardens lit by hundreds of lanterns below. The long dining table seated 60 guests beneath 2 rows of cascading crystal chandeliers, each one custom-made by a glass-blowing studio in Murano. Orchids and white roses spilled from low arrangements between silver candelabras, and every place setting held 3 crystal glasses, 2 gold-rimmed plates, and silverware engraved with the Caldwell royal crest. It was the most beautiful room in the kingdom of Valdenmere, and Seraphina had arranged every detail of it herself. Nobody mentioned that at dinner. Across the table, her younger sister Isolde rose dramatically from her chair and extended her left hand directly beneath the chandelier light. The engagement ring caught every beam and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. A central diamond the size of a hazelnut sat surrounded by pink sapphires set in rose gold. "Have you even looked at it properly, Sira?" Isolde laughed, stretching her hand closer to her eldest sister's face. "Dorian spent nearly $250,000 on it. The sapphires came from Ceylon." Several guests gasped appreciatively. Someone began photographing it immediately. "It is extraordinary, Isolde," Seraphina said quietly. "Do not lose heart, darling," said Lady Myrtle from the end of the table, adjusting her pearl earring with a pitying smile. "There are still widowers with excellent estates in the northern provinces. Perhaps one of them might suit." Soft laughter spread across the table. Isolde giggled behind her champagne glass. Their middle sister Valentina exchanged a glance with their youngest sister Cressida and covered her mouth with a fan. King Aldrich Caldwell sat at the head of the table. He was broad, silver-haired, and immovable as stone in all things. He lifted his glass slowly. "All 3 of my daughters have brought distinction to this family," he declared, his voice carrying easily across the whole. Then his gaze moved to Seraphina at the far end. "In their respective ways." The hall fell momentarily quiet. Every guest at the table understood exactly what had been left unspoken. Seraphina felt the familiar burn move up her throat and settle behind her eyes. She pressed it down the same way she always did, carefully, completely, without letting it reach her face. She pushed her chair back slowly and excused herself. She had nearly reached the corridor doors when they burst open ahead of her. A palace herald in a formal navy uniform stepped forward and struck his ceremonial staff once against the marble floor. His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Callum Ashford of the Royal House of Varenthia. The entire room turned. But Seraphina had already stepped through the side door and into the quiet of the corridor beyond. She stood alone in the marble hallway, breathing slowly, while the sound of renewed applause filtered through the closed doors behind her. Somewhere above the palace, through a tall arched window, the sky over the city of Caillemont burned deep violet and orange at the edges as the sun finished setting over the capital. Her lady's maid, Petra, appeared around the corner carrying a small tray with warm chamomile tea and a single shortbread biscuit. "I thought you might need this, Your Highness," Petra said simply. Seraphina accepted the tea without speaking. For a moment she simply stood at the window watching the city lights come on below, one by one, like small answers to questions nobody had asked. "You organized this entire evening," Petra said after a moment. "The flowers, the menu, the seating, the musicians. You have been working on it for 6 weeks." "Yes," Seraphina said. "And nobody thanked you." Serafina looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Her gown was pale blue silk, simple and elegant. Her dark hair was pinned carefully. She looked exactly like what she was, a princess who had learned to be invisible at her own family's table. "Go back inside, Petra," she said gently. "I will follow in a moment." She stood alone at the window for a long time after that, watching the city of Callum light up below the palace walls. The weeks leading to Isolde's official engagement celebration transformed Caldwell Palace into something that fashion magazines would later describe as the most beautiful private event of the decade. Lorries arrived daily through the palace's service gates carrying crates of pink and ivory peonies from a flower farm in the south of France. Custom silk table runners commissioned from a studio in Milan, hand-poured pillar candles in pale gold, and 300 crystal champagne coupes engraved with the date of Isolde's engagement. A pastry team flew in from Paris to construct a 5-tiered engagement cake, decorated with edible gold and sugar-spun flowers. A string quartet rehearsed nightly in the West Corridor, while an internationally known florist transformed the ballroom columns into living towers of white wisteria and blush roses. Queen Margaux, regal and relentless in equal measure, spent each morning in planning meetings, and each afternoon approving or rejecting proposals, with the focused energy of a woman who viewed a royal celebration as a competitive event. She wore couture suits even at breakfast, and spoke to event coordinators in the measured tone of someone who had never once doubted her own judgment. Serafina managed everything beneath her mother's direction without complaint. She coordinated the catering logistics, resolved a dispute between 2 competing florists, personally drove to the port city of Havenshire to collect a shipment of specialty wines when a courier company made an error, and spent 3 consecutive evenings reorganizing the seating chart after the guest list changed 4 times. Not once did Queen Margaux say thank you. The morning of the celebration, Isolde swept through the palace in a dressing gown, with a team of 5 beauty professionals trailing behind her. She paused in the corridor only long enough to glance at a flower arrangement Serafina was adjusting near the ballroom entrance. "That cluster on the left is uneven, Sira," she said without slowing her stride. "Fix it before guests arrive, would you?" Serafina fixed it. The arrangement had not been uneven. By evening, the palace ballroom was extraordinary. The ceiling had been fitted with a canopy of thousands of tiny warm lights that gave the impression of standing beneath a sky full of close stars. The women who arrived wore gowns in champagne and ivory and deep rose. The men wore black tie with coloured pocket squares. A jazz band played softly from the elevated stage, while staff in white gloves moved silently between guests with silver trays of smoked salmon blinis, stuffed mushrooms with truffle cream, miniature beef Wellingtons, and chilled lobster tails served with saffron yoli. The champagne was a vintage from the Caldwell family's own vineyard in the eastern province. Serafina stood near the musicians, adjusting a display of programs when an older countess approached her. "You are the eldest Caldwell daughter, are you not?" the countess said warmly. "What a lovely face. When shall we be celebrating your engagement, my dear?" The question hit the way it always did, cleanly, precisely, in exactly the right place. Before Serafina could answer, a woman nearby sighed audibly. "At her age, I am afraid the suitable candidates have rather thinned," she murmured to her companion. "One does admire her composure, though," the companion replied in a stage whisper clearly designed to carry. Serafina excused herself from the countess, placed the programs on the nearest table, and walked toward the terrace doors. She had barely reached them when Isolde's voice rang across the nearest section of the room. "Careful carrying those, Sira. People will think you work here." The laughter that followed was the kind that pretends to be friendly. Serafina stepped through the terrace doors into the cool evening air. The gardens below glowed with the amber light of 100 lanterns strung between the manicured hedges, and beyond the palace walls, the city of Callum stretched in every direction, lit and alive, and completely unaware of her. She pressed her hands against the stone balustrade and breathed slowly. That was when she heard carriage wheels, no, the quiet electric hum of a luxury motorcade, pulling through the palace front gates below, black vehicles with tinted glass, flags on the bonnets, security personnel moving along the gravel drive. As she straightened slowly, from the corridor behind her, the herald's voice carried through the open door. His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Callum Ashford of Varenthia. Serafina turned to look. Crown Prince Callum Ashford of Varenthia had attended more royal celebrations than he could count, and enjoyed approximately none of them. He was 39 years old, heir to the House of Ashford, and possessed of a fortune large enough that 3 separate financial publications had dedicated cover stories to estimating it. He controlled shipping interests across 5 international ports, a technology investment portfolio that several governments had quietly sought his counsel on, and an estate in the coastal city of Bournemouth that required a staff of 40 to maintain. His name appeared in diplomatic dispatches, parliamentary debates, and society columns with equal and unrequested frequency. He had come to Callum because King Aldrich Caldwell was a significant ally, and the invitation had been formal enough to require a personal appearance. He intended to stay for exactly 3 hours. Inside the Caldwell Palace ballroom, the attention his arrival generated was immediate and faintly suffocating. Women he had never met rearranged themselves subtly in his direction. Mothers materialized at his elbow with daughters in tow. Someone complimented his family's maritime holdings within 45 seconds of his entering the room, which was a record even by the standards of these events. Callum accepted a glass of champagne and moved toward the edge of the crowd. That was when the incident happened. A young serving girl, no older than 17, stumbled near one of the display tables. A full tray of champagne coupes slid from her hands and shattered across the marble floor in an eruption of breaking glass and pale liquid. The girl stood frozen in the sudden silence, her face white with horror, while nearby guests stepped backward and several women made sharp noises of irritation. "How clumsy," someone said clearly. "These staff really ought to be better trained," another added. The girl's hands were shaking. She began bending down toward the broken glass, which was exactly the wrong thing to do with no protection on her hands. Then a figure in pale blue silk moved swiftly from across the room. The woman knelt beside the girl without hesitating, without looking around first to check who was watching, and without any expression on her face other than calm concern. She took the girl's hands gently and drew them away from the broken glass. She produced a small handkerchief from somewhere and pressed it against a cut on the girl's finger. She spoke quietly, too quietly for Callum to hear from where he stood, but he could see the girl's shoulders come down from around her ears and the shaking gradually stop. The woman in blue then stood, flagged a senior member of the palace staff with a single look, and within 60 seconds the glass was being swept up. The girl had been guided discreetly away from the room, and the moment had dissolved as though it had never happened. Callum had not moved. Something shifted in the region of his chest, in a way he had not felt in a considerable number of years. He watched the woman in blue for the remainder of the evening. He noticed she stayed near the edges of the room. He noticed the way serving staff smiled when she approached them, a different quality of smile than the professional deference they showed everyone else, something warmer and more voluntary. He noticed that she had clearly organized the entire event, because he could see her making small corrections and quiet adjustments throughout the evening that kept everything running smoothly. He also noticed the way her family spoke to her. During the seated supper, roasted duck with cherry reduction, creamed potatoes with chive, a delicate pea and mint soup, fresh bread with cultured butter, and individual chocolate fondants that arrived precisely warm. The younger sister raised her champagne glass with a bright smile. To the last Caldwell daughter bringing honor through a fine match, she said, her eyes drifted toward the woman in blue. Though I suppose miracles do still occur, even for the very patient among us. Laughter moved around the near tables. The woman in blue lowered her gaze to her plate. She did not respond. Callum set down his champagne glass. He stood slowly. The movement was enough to quiet the nearest section of the room, because a man of his profile standing unexpectedly at a seated dinner was the sort of thing people noticed. He crossed the ballroom floor. He stopped in front of the woman in pale blue silk. She looked up at him with an expression of complete and unperformed surprise. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "would you honor me with a dance?" The entire ballroom stopped. Heat rushed visibly into her face. Around them, 50 conversations went silent within the same breath. Her voice recovered after a half-second. "Of course, Your Highness," she said. Her fingers rested in his hand. They were trembling slightly. As the orchestra shifted into a waltz, and they moved together across the center of the floor, the center she had spent the whole evening giving to everyone else, Callum felt with absolute certainty that he had just made the most interesting decision of the evening, and possibly considerably longer than that. Around them the ballroom whispered, not at him for once, but at her. Lady Vivienne Ashmore, standing near the champagne display in a deep red gown, lowered her glass and watched with an expression she did not bother to make pleasant. Crown Prince Callum began appearing at Caldwell Palace so regularly that the head housekeeper started preparing his preferred blend of black tea before his motorcade was even through the palace gates. At first, the visits were attributed to diplomatic business. The Caldwell and Ashford families maintained significant trade agreements, and there were genuine discussions to be had. But the discussions were brief, and Callum consistently remained for hours afterward. He and Serafina walked the palace gardens. They sat in the library for entire afternoons. She showed him the East Wing restoration project she had been quietly managing for 2 years. A careful modernization of the palace's oldest rooms that preserved original architectural details while introducing clean contemporary design, engineered oak floors, hidden lighting systems, custom furnishings commissioned from craftspeople in the kingdom. He asked more questions about it than anyone else ever had. Serafina tried to remain sensible about all of it. She had been sensible her entire life. It had protected her from very little, but it was the tool she trusted most, and she held on to it carefully even as something warmer began to make itself at home in her chest. Inside the palace, the effect of Callum's attention was seismic. Queen Margox suddenly developed a keen interest in Serafina's wardrobe. Gowns began arriving from the royal couturier without anyone asking for them. A deep emerald evening dress with a structured bodice and flowing silk skirt, a champagne day suit with pearl buttons, a royal blue gown with a dramatic shoulder detail, and a train that caught the light when she walked. Her mother appeared in her rooms before events now, adjusting her jewelry with focused attention. "Your hair should be down," Queen Margox said one afternoon, reaching to release Serafina's pinned style without asking. "The Crown Prince notices hair." Serafina looked at her mother's reflection in the mirror. Something moved behind her eyes that was too complex to name. "He already notices, Mother," she said quietly. King Aldrich invited Serafina to sit beside him at important meetings now. He referenced her opinions on matters she had been offering opinions about, unrequested for 15 years. He introduced her to visiting dignitaries with what sounded remarkably like pride. Her sisters watched all of this and burned quietly. Valentina's own marriage, which society had celebrated with enormous fanfare 3 years earlier, had developed the particular cold silence of two people who had mistaken attraction for compatibility. Her husband spent most of his time at their country estate without her. Cressida, the youngest, had made a glamorous match with a property developer from the coastal city of Mirepoix, only to discover that glamour and kindness were not the same quality. Isolde, the newly engaged, was beginning to notice that her fiancé Dorian's considerable charm operated somewhat selectively, generously in public, not at all in private. None of the sisters examined their own situations. They examined Serafina. Valentina said it one afternoon in the sitting room, not troubling herself to lower her voice. "She is performing vulnerability," she said. "Men like Callum Ashford are drawn to women who appear to need rescuing. She has simply worked out how to appear that way." Cressida agreed immediately. "She has always been like this," she said. "Playing the quiet, selfless one, it is very calculated." Isolde twisted her engagement ring on her finger. "Once he understands what she actually is," she said. "Dull, humorless, obsessed with curtain fabric and restoration budgets, he will lose interest entirely." They said these things in rooms they thought were private. The real crisis came in the form of Lady Vivienne Ashmore. Vivienne had been the great romantic story of Callum's life several years earlier. Beautiful, sophisticated, from an impeccable family, and possessed of the particular gift of making every man in a room feel like the most important person in it. Callum had believed for nearly 2 years that this gift was something she offered only to him. The discovery that it was considerably more widely distributed, specifically in the direction of a titled gentleman with a grander estate and a more expedient fortune, had been the kind of wound that does not close cleanly. Valentina arranged for Vivienne to be invited to a palace dinner. The dinner was held in the intimate east dining room, 18 guests around a round table of pale oak set with modern gold-rimmed tableware and low arrangements of white ranunculus. Vivienne arrived in black silk and diamonds and moved through the room as though it had been designed specifically for her entrance. She positioned herself beside Callum before the first course arrived. Serafina sat across the table and watched. Vivienne was masterful. She laughed at precisely the right moments. She touched Callum's arm when making a point. She referenced shared memories with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed them. She leaned toward him once and said something quiet, and Serafina watched Callum's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Later that evening, after the guests had moved to the drawing room, Serafina stepped into the corridor for air. She stood at the tall window at the end of the hall, pressing her fingers against the cool glass, watching the lanterns sway in the garden below. Callum appeared behind hers. "She told me I was happier before I became so serious," he said without preamble. Serafina did not turn around. "Were you?" she asked. "No," he said, "I was simply more easily deceived." He paused. "I came to find you." She turned then. He had the look of a man who had been making a decision for some time, and had recently finished making it. That same evening, after Callum had left, he passed the half-open door of the blue sitting room on his way out and heard voices inside. He recognized Valentina's voice first. "She will embarrass herself chasing him," Valentina said. "Women like Sira do not hold the attention of men like Callum Ashford. It is simply reality." Cressida's voice followed. "He will realize soon enough," she said. "She has nothing to offer him except competence, and no man of his standing requires a wife who is merely competent." Callum stopped walking. He stood outside the sitting room door for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pushed it open. The room fell instantly silent. Valentina and Cressida and Isolde turned toward him. Queen Margox, seated near the fireplace, went very still. King Aldrich looked at the floor. Callum's voice when he spoke was completely controlled. "I would like to understand," he said, "what it is that Princess Serafina has done to merit the treatment she receives in this house." Nobody answered. She organized this palace's most celebrated events for years without acknowledgement. He continued. She manages the restoration work, handles diplomatic correspondence, and treats every person in this building, from yourselves to the youngest member of the serving staff, with the same consistent decency. And you speak of her as though she is an inconvenience. A silence. I find that remarkable, he said, and not in a way that reflects well on any of you. He left without waiting for a response. He found Serafina at the end of the east corridor, near the window where she so often went to be alone. She had heard raised voices and had correctly guessed something had happened. When he told her what he had said, she was quiet for a long moment. No one has ever done that before, she said finally. Her voice was very steady, but her eyes were not. Callum looked at her in the low light of the corridor. In the pocket of his jacket, against his ribs, a small velvet box pressed with quiet patience against the fabric. The Grand Royal Gala at Varenthia Palace was the most anticipated event of the social season. Held annually in the magnificent ballroom of the Ashford family's principal residence in the harbour city of Bournemouth, it drew 500 guests from across 5 kingdoms and had been photographed for the covers of international publications for 20 consecutive years. Varenthia Palace itself was a marvel of contemporary royal design, a vast building of pale stone and glass set above the harbour. Its facade a series of sweeping curved arches, fitted entirely with floor-to-ceiling glazing, that made the interior appear to float between sea and sky. The ballroom on the upper level was 3 stories high, with a glass ceiling through which guests could see the stars on clear nights. The walls were white limestone with recessed gold lighting. The floor was pale oak inlaid with a geometric pattern in darker wood, polished to a mirror finish. Long silk curtains in deep ivory moved softly in the conditioned air. Every surface was modern, deliberate, and breathtakingly beautiful. On the evening of the gala, it had been transformed further still. 12-foot floral installations of white orchids and gold-sprayed foliage stood at intervals along the walls. Tables were dressed in champagne silk, with arrangements of white anemones and pale gold candles. Staff in black moved between 500 guests with trays of handcrafted canapés, seared scallops on cauliflower cream, Wagyu beef on brioche, burrata with heirloom tomato, caviar on blini with cream fresh, while sommelier teams poured. Vintages from 3 different countries. It was, in every conceivable way, the most beautiful room Serafina had ever stood in. She wore deep sapphire blue that evening. The gown had been made for her by the royal couturier, structured at the bodice with a low back and a full silk skirt that moved when she walked, embroidered at the hem with tiny crystals that caught the light. Her dark hair was down. She wore her grandmother's diamond earrings and nothing else. Petra had looked at her in the mirror before she left and said simply, "There you are." The Caldwell family had travelled together to Bournemouth for the gala. Valentina and Cressida arrived in complimentary gowns of rose and gold. Isolde wore ivory silk with a sweetheart neckline and her famous engagement ring. King Aldrich and Queen Margox processed formally through the receiving line with the ease of 40 years of practice. Serafina arrived quietly and moved to the edge of the room. Lady Vivienne Ashmore was present. She wore emerald green and diamonds, and had positioned herself with the expertise of someone who understood rooms as strategic environments. Her eyes moved to Serafina once, and then away with deliberate indifference. When Crown Prince Callum entered the ballroom from the private corridor at the far end, the room changed in the way that rooms do when a person of significant presence enters them. Conversations slowed, women straightened, mothers near eligible daughters made small unconscious adjustments. Vivienne smiled and began moving in his direction. Callum did not look at her. He moved through the room steadily, greeting guests with the brief warmth of a man who is being polite, but is not pausing. His eyes moving across the crowd with a specific purpose that anyone watching carefully could have identified. In his right hand, held slightly against his side, was a small box covered in deep navy velvet. Serafina was standing near the tall windows at the edge of the ballroom, watching the harbour lights below, when she heard the slight change in the ambient noise of the room. That particular drop in volume that happens when 500 people simultaneously noticed the same thing. She turned. Callum had stopped in front of her. Around them, the ballroom had gone as quiet as 500 people in an enormous glass room can manage. Serafina looked at the box in his hand, then at his face. She forgot to arrange her expression. Callum opened the boxes. The ring inside was extraordinary. A central oval diamond of exceptional clarity sat in a setting of white gold, with 2 deep blue sapphires flanking it on each side, their colour precisely matching the blue of the gown she was wearing, which had not been a coincidence because he had spoken to the jeweller 4 months earlier and described the colour of her eyes instead. He spoke clearly enough that the nearest guests could hear him, and quietly enough that it did not feel like a performance. "I have attended more rooms like this one than I can remember," he said, "and I have spent most of them looking for someone who is interested in something other than what I represent." Serafina did not move. "You are the only person I have met who treats the people who serve you with the same care that you show the people above you," he said. "You are the only one who moved toward that girl before anyone else. You are the only one who has asked me in all the hours we have spent together what I actually think, and then listened to the answer." Her eyes were bright. "You have spent years making beautiful things for other people's celebrations," he said, and standing at the edge of the room afterward. Behind him, Valentina's face had gone the colour of old chalk. Cressida had stopped pretending to adjust her bracelet. Isolde was perfectly still. Queen Margot sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on Serafina with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite regret, and was something uncomfortably close to both. Callum lowered himself to one knee on the pale oak floor. The room stopped entirely. "Serafina Caldwell," he said, "will you do me the honour of becoming my crown princess?" The silence lasted a long time. Then Serafina laughed, not the careful, correct laugh she had spent years practicing for public rooms, but a real one, brief and broken and completely unmanaged. And through it, with tears moving freely down her cheeks for the first time in a very long time, she nodded. "Yes," she said. The ballroom came apart in applause. Petra, standing with the ladies' maids along the far wall, pressed both hands over her mouth and closed her eyes. Lady Vivienne Ashmore turned toward the terrace doors and walked through them alone. King Aldrich Caldwell sat very still for a long moment. Then he rose with the rest of the room and began to applaud his eldest daughter, though the expression on his face was the complicated one of a man who understands, too late, what he failed to see clearly for 33 years. In the years that followed, Crown Princess Serafina of Varenthia became known across the 5 kingdoms not for her title or her palace, or the extraordinary photographs that filled international publications each season, but for the qualities she had always carried in rooms where nobody bothered to look. She opened sections of Varenthia Palace to visiting artists and scholars. She established a foundation that funded training programs for young people from working households across the kingdom. She remembered names. She noticed people. She continued treating every person she encountered, from visiting heads of state to the youngest palace staff member, with the same consistent, unperforming decency that had once made her invisible to everyone, except the man who mattered most. Callum, who had spent years building an empire in rooms full of people who wanted something from him, told her privately on their first anniversary that what he valued most about their life together was that she had never once wanted something from him that he could put a price on. She had laughed and told him that was the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. He had agreed and said it again more carefully, and she had forgiven him. Her sisters' lives did not collapse dramatically. They simply became quieter and smaller and more honest than they had expected. Valentina's marriage ended without theatre, and she eventually rebuilt herself into something more genuine. Cressida learned that admiration is not the same as respect, and began pursuing the latter. Isolde's engagement survived, but was transformed by the discovery that a diamond ring and a devoted husband are not automatically the same gift. The thing they had all failed to understand, and which Serafina had never needed to say aloud, was that worth does not wait to be discovered. It simply continues, quietly and without performance, until the right person finally looks up from the crowd and sees it clearly. And in the great modern ballroom of Varenthia Palace, above the harbour where the lights shimmered on dark water, on the night that Crown Prince Callum Ashford knelt on a pale oak floor and asked a woman in sapphire blue to become his princess, an entire room of 500 people finally looked up. And they all saw her. Perhaps for the very first time. Real love and true worth were never found in beauty, youth, or status, but in loyalty and kindness. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let us get back to Serafina, because the most powerful man in the room just stood up.